There's been a lot of news coverage about the IAEA. That stands for the International Atomic Energy Agency, based in Vienna. And it's been in the news because they're dealing with nuclear arms in Iran and the Russian occupation of the, I can't pronounce the name, it's got like 12 syllables, plant in Ukraine. Our very own Jackie Wolcott, chair of our program committee, was the U.S. ambassador to the IAEA, and she was stationed in Vienna until the Biden administration took over. Lucky for us, she moved to Naples, and Ambassador Wolcott will introduce today's keynote speaker.
Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate your mentioning the work that I was able to do for President Trump and Secretary Pompeo at the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. I'd venture to say that the IAEA is one of the best international organizations which exists in today's world, doing some of the most important work on the globe at a very critical time. And the two that Kathy mentioned, both in Iran and at Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in Ukraine, you've all seen it. It's luckily we have a good head of the IAEA that the United States helped get elected. And anyway, I appreciate your mentioning it. I wanted to say, while that was my last position in government, which ended last January, going back to my earlier days at the State Department, I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Organization Affairs, essentially UN, really just beginning my diplomatic career and learning all the highs and lows of the UN. As part of my responsibilities, I had oversight of U.S. participation in the UN Commission on Human Rights in Geneva, Switzerland. It's now called the UN Human Rights Council. It was through that job that I had the great honor of meeting and working with Ambassador Armando Valladares. His story is quite amazing. Armando was a political prisoner in Castro's Cuba for 22 years and had become known worldwide as a poet and artist while in prison for his anti-Castro stance. International pressure finally helped gain his release in 1982. He resettled in the U.S. and wrote a riveting book, Against All Hope, which I still recommend that you might read, detailing his prison time and torture at the hands of the Cuban government. In 1987, President Reagan appointed him U.S. ambassador to the UN Commission on Human Rights. Now, that was a gutsy move and a real slap in Fidel's face. Armando spoke limited English and, of course, had no diplomatic training. But he proudly and fiercely represented the United States in Geneva with a passion earned from personal experience, calling out human rights abuses with, not surprisingly, special focus on Cuba. And always by his side was his key aide-de-camp and fellow UN delegate, Kristina Arriaga, translating his words, guiding him on policy, strategy, and keeping him and me, thankfully, mostly out of diplomatic trouble. It was the beginning of more than 30 years of professional work and friendship between Kristina and me. So it is such a special honor for me to be able to welcome her here today on behalf of the Women's Republican Club of Naples Federated to tell us in her own words about her amazing life story. Kristina is one of those unique people I would describe as a force of nature, fearless. And no matter what she takes on, she does it with that well-known Cuban-American tenacity, with passion and precision, getting to the heart of whatever the matter, researching, writing, advocating, being the squeaky wheel when one is needed, or using her infectious humor to win over people and get things done. Kristina describes herself as a conservative Cuban-American who has made it her business to advocate for individual freedoms worldwide. To me, she's the living embodiment of a freedom fighter for First Amendment rights. Speech, religion, press, assembly, and the right to petition the government. As executive director of a prestigious public interest law firm in Washington, Kristina oversaw and won several landmark freedom of religion cases brought before the U.S. Supreme Court. One famous case you might recall involved litigation against the Little Sisters of the Poor. And if you Google it, there was Kristina coming down the front stairs of the Supreme Court with the sisters on the evening news following their big win. There are other such cases that I hope we'll hear from her about today. As luck, fate, or God would have it, more than 25 years after she and I worked together at the UN, Kristina was appointed by Speaker Ryan in 2016 as Commissioner of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. The same year, I also was appointed a commissioner by a Senate Majority Leader. That experience might be worth a whole speech on its own one day, but suffice it to say, we were up against some very liberal commissioners appointed by President Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer, not to mention a world of ever-increasing persecution and religious freedom atrocities. Kristina was chosen by her colleagues as co-chair for 2 years and never shied away from a fight for a good cause. She willingly traveled to some very difficult hotspots around the world to address human rights and religious freedom issues, including several trips to Turkey on behalf of American pastor Andrew Brunson, unjustly imprisoned there. She might not take credit herself, but I firmly believe her activism and persistence on his behalf helped lead to his eventual release, and certainly gave the pastor and his wife Noreen hope over long months that when they otherwise had very little to keep them going. Today, Kristina serves as a trustee of the independent oversight board that makes binding decisions on content moderation for Facebook and Instagram. It is a fascinating, challenging, and controversial subject, what should or should not be allowed to be published on social media. But just imagine, therefore, how important it is to have a conservative, committed, and fearless freedom of speech advocate represented in this effort, and what she's undoubtedly up against. Now, most importantly, Kristina is married to a wonderful U.S. Marine, Matthew Buchholz, who did our Pledge of Allegiance for us today. And he's here with her today, of course, and it happens to be their 27th wedding anniversary today. So, Matthew, we're delighted you would come to Naples to celebrate your anniversary with all of us Republican women and a few men. Kristina and Matthew are the parents of 3 great young people, including Julia, who is currently serving on a Navy destroyer. And please let me state what may be obvious to all of us here, but we in Naples love our military and our veterans, so thank you. There is so much more I could say on the subject of these great patriots, but better yet, let's let Kristina tell her own story in her own way. So please join me in warmly welcoming Kristina Arriaga.
Thank you. I'm quite klutzy, and I didn't want to fall on the way up, so I used the side with the banister. So, thank you so much, Jackie, and I'm so glad to see you here in Florida among such great people. I must say I feel pretty lonely in the People's Republic of Alexandria, Virginia, where we lived not too far from each other for many years. But I also feel like an honorary Florida resident. My brother and wife and their 2 kids live in Weston, Florida. My mother lives in Fort Lauderdale. Many of my cousins, as a good Cuban American, many of my cousins are in Hialeah. The nicer part of the family is in Key Biscayne, I should say. We have great and loud, boisterous families reunions here in Florida. So thank you so much for allowing me to come to your state. And thanks again for having me. So Before I start, I have to tell you something, and it is that us people of Cuban descent like to take credit for just about everything. Coca-Cola, we all know that was invented in Havana in the 1900s, and then somehow it made it here, right? Gatorade, it was a Cuban chemist who told the Gators how to make Gatorade. I spoke to the Cades who actually invented, and they told me the story is true, so I can vouch for it. Andy Garcia, Cuban. Gloria Estefan, Cuban, right? Cameron Diaz, half Cuban, we'll take her. Granted, the CIA agent that broke into Watergate, also Cuban, but you know. So the story I'm about to tell you is not Cuban exaggeration. It actually happened, and it's true. And you may not know about it. So go back to the year 1781. George Washington is in a lot of trouble. For 2 years, they have been very harsh winters. The Continental Army is having great difficulty resourcing. And his soldiers are beginning to think about desertion or maybe mutiny. And if you're an American history buff, you will remember that the French were here helping us, and that Rochambeau was with George Washington preparing to invade Virginia, which was occupied by British General George Cornwallis. Sorry, my accent will get in the way sometimes. Imagine when I drink how thick it is. So Rochambeau is a little concerned, and he writes Admiral de Grasse. Now, Admiral de Grasse is coming from Europe with 24 frigates to help the Continental Army. And he writes him this letter. I must not conceal from you, monsieur, that the Americans are at the end of their resources, that Washington will not have half the troops he's reckoned to have to defend Virginia. So Admiral de Grasse, coming through the Caribbean, has to raise the money needed to make sure that the Continental Army can prevail. So he stopped in Havana to appeal to Cubans to give him some money so that he can help George Washington's army. Now, he was in luck because Cubans have a very long memory. And in 1761, the British had occupied Havana and had looted the businesses, leaving behind a disdain and hatred for anything British. And the Cubans had just been free for 17 years. They had just overcome the Spanish-American War. But it was not the Cuban government that came to the aid of Admiral de Grasse. It was a group of ladies, the ladies of Havana, who belonged to a cultural patriotic organization, much like this group of ladies in Naples. And before the end of the day, these ladies had donated 1.2 million pounds of silver. They had taken their earrings, their bracelets, their rings, and they had donated it so that the American Continental Army could survive. And the gift came with a letter that said, so the American mother's sons are not born as slaves. This is a gift, so the American mother's sons are not born as slaves. A historian, Stephen Bosal, argued that the collection sent by the ladies of Havana was the foundation of the pivotal victory of the American revolutionaries at Yorktown. And I have to say I agree. 1.2 million pounds is equivalent to $262 million today. The same historian said that the millions that were supplied were the bottom dollars upon which the building of American independence was erected. I've often wondered if this gift played any part in George Washington being so determined to establish a model of leadership that was not a crown. We all know the stories with their legend of truth of him renouncing the crown. We do know he did not make himself a king, and we do know he definitely did not make himself a god. He and his contemporaries were acutely aware of establishing the provenance of rights. Where did our rights come from? If the rights came from themselves or from the government, they set up, it meant that at the government's whim, those rights could be taken away. In the snap of a monarch's fingers, or with a government bureaucrat, they could take our rights away, right? Even if an unjust leader suppressed these rights, because they came from within, because they lived in our hearts, no one could really take those rights away. Centuries later, Cubans would find this bittersweet truth, and my father certainly did. On my desk, I have this wonderful picture of my father taken in 1957. He's 26 years old. He's about to embark on the Queen Mary, spend several weeks at sea and then in Europe, and he's smiling, face to me. The type of smile you see is like you're about to embark on a great adventure. He's young and carefree and healthy. And little does he know in that photograph that only 4 years later he would lose everything, that he would be destitute, that he would have to go into exile, that he would lose his homeland, that most of his family would remain behind in Cuba, never to be seen again, that his plan to learn English watching I Love Lucy would not work, that he would have to move to Puerto Rico and for 7 years, and for many years worked 7 days a week, sometimes selling vacuum cleaners from house to house to make ends meet. That the watch he's wearing in that picture, he would have to sell to buy groceries for his wife and 3 young children. That his best friend Eddie, another 26-year-old, will oppose the Castro regime, and he would be incarcerated for 17 years, enduring unspeakable torture. When that photo was taken, Castro was already in the mountains, recruiting followers who would come into Havana to popular acclaim, wearing beards like prophets of old. You may remember the images on television. Young Castro coming in. Few people knew that Havana had more television sets at that time than any city in the United States. And while people were hypnotized, he murdered hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children. He changed books. F is for Fidel, M is for the motherland. He expelled religious leaders. Carmina, where is Carmina? Carmina was telling me earlier that her town only had 7 streets named after the heroes of the Spanish-American War, Jose Marti. And those streets were changed, and they were numbered. Does it sound familiar, by the way? Yeah. Back here in the United States in the 1950s, we were looking around the world. We were seeing communism spread. So there was a revival of patriotism. And we went back to George Washington for inspiration, and that's why at that time, Congress changed the Pledge of Allegiance to include the words under God. The Pledge of Allegiance, as we recite it today, underscores the philosophy that where our rights come from. Our rights do not come from the state, therefore the state cannot take them away, ever. Yes, amen indeed. And when I say the state, I don't mean the president or Congress or the Supreme Court. I mean locally elected officials. This is why your work is so important. Because you're on the ground. You know that any government official who takes any right of ours for any arbitrary reason, no matter how small it is, he or she needs to be stopped short. And because my father had been raised and had experienced an Orwellian country with the Ministry of Truth, controlling everything, we grew up with a strong allergy to government intrusion in any way, small, big, small, in any way. My father raised us to understand that in this great country of ours, no one touches what's in our head or in our hearts, ever. So we became good troublemakers, not sheeples. Yeah, troublemaker gets a bad rap, but I think it's an important thing to do. So in that spirit, in 2014, when the Obama administration told the Little Sisters of the Poor that they had to violate their conscience and pay for contraceptives and abortion-causing drugs for their employees, or face millions of dollars in fines that would destroy their ministry, I was proud to lead the group of attorneys that sued the heck out of the Obama administration all the way to the Supreme Court. Thank you. Yes, and we won. I don't know how many Americans are aware that the Obama administration pressed on the Little Sisters, but they exempted the largest employer in the world, the US military. They exempted big oil companies. They exempted New York City insurance programs, but not the Little Sisters because they were too religious. Over 22 years, I worked at a law firm that took cases just like this one. I can tell you many stories, but the most ridiculous case we handled was that of actually a Florida pastor. His name is Roberto Soto, and he was a Lipan Apache, that's a Native American, and he used eagle feathers in his religious ceremonies. Now, we all know the eagle is not endangered, but there are old stories, old laws in the books that prohibit anyone from even picking up an eagle feather. If you walk through a park and you pick up a feather of a migratory bird, you might be fined or go to prison. Still in the books. So some obsessed government official in the Department of Interior wanted to know if Robert was using eagle feathers in the ceremony. So get this, they started a secret operation called Operation Powwow, where some federal government official actually dressed like an Indian went in there to see if Robert was using eagle feathers, arrested him, sent him to prison, and fined him. That case was in court for years and years. Of course, we won. But this is our tax dollars at work. We know in this country that the First Amendment protects our rights, that everyone, A to Z, atheist to Zoroastrian, has the right to live according to their deeply held religious beliefs. Those are not confined to your house or to your house of worship. You can bring those beliefs into the public sphere and to home. Of course, the government can step in if there's an excess. Many people argue that we should not have human sacrifice. If you have teenagers, you start to wonder about that law. But of course, there are limits, right? Later on, when I served with Jackie at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and I learned that our own State Department did not want to make waves when an American pastor had been held in prison for over a year, I stepped in. Wasn't pretty, so let me tell you the story. When I was appointed to USERV, I took an oath of office administered by Justice Gorsuch, that I would defend religious freedom unflinchingly, and that I would uphold our Constitution. And I thought the biggest threats to religious freedom would be China and Cuba and North Korea, and of course, all those countries present a great threat. But in the course of my work, I was reminded that the primary goal of most government bureaucrats is to keep their cushy taxpayer-funded job. Not to stand up for the rights of Americans, not to uphold the Constitution, not to do a good job. It's unfortunate. And that is as dangerous to the Republic as the threat of any foreign autocrat. Small government means more freedom. I met a lot of patriotic people in Congress and in the Senate and serving us, but unfortunately, I also met a lot of bureaucrats at the Department of State. So it's customary when commissioners travel to go into the Department of State and have a briefing, so I dutifully went to the briefing. And as I was leaving the Department of State, Pam Pryor, who headed at the time evangelical coalitions for President Trump, and Jackie had introduced me to, said, "Hey, Kristina, I hear you're going to Turkey. What are you going to do about Andrew Brunson?" Who's Andrew Brunson? No one had bothered to mention this American held in prison. So I went back into the Department of State, and I said that I wanted to see him in prison. Of course, the answer was no, blah, blah, blah. But a week later, I found myself in a smear in a high-security prison. Any prison is scary. A Turkish prison, even more so. When I walked in after being strip searched, I was escorted to an interrogation room that was padded in black. There was nothing except a Formica table with a pen in the middle. I sat on a cheap, squeaky plastic chair. And of course, the silence augmented any movement in the room and any noise that the chair made. And then it started. I heard the clanging and clanging of gates and the creaking of locks and doors opening. And in walked Andrew Brunson. He was the shadow of a man that I had seen in pictures. He had lost 50 pounds. He wept inconsolably the entire time, could hardly make eye contact. We are the first Americans to visit him in prison, besides his wife and the consular officer. And during the 1-hour conversation, he said his biggest fear was to be forgotten. He repeated that over and over. My biggest fear is to be forgotten. I have to say, there are a lot of things to fear in a Turkish prison when you're the only Christian, the only American, the only English speaker. So I vowed to him that I would fight to make sure he wasn't. Now, please, I mean, Jackie's nice to give me credit, but I did what any of you in this room would have done, any decent American would have done. I cannot take credit for his campaign or for the hundreds of people who advocated for him. But I also vowed that I would attend all his trials. I'll fast forward through the messy middle when I was followed by Turkish state security. The Department of State refused to give me a security detail. I was stranded in an airport in Izmir for 2 days. It was messy. But the final trial for Andrew Bunsen was held, and he was found guilty. But the verdict comes after being pronounced guilty. And in Turkey and in other countries, there is a sort of a strange thing that happens when you're pronounced guilty. You're sent back home. It's a special kind of torture to be in prison, to go back home for a day, only to be thrown in prison again. So Andrew went back home to his apartment in Izmir. And this is where the magic happens. There were no commercial flights that afternoon out of Izmir. The embassy didn't know what to do. And somehow a U.S. Air Force airplane landed in Izmir, picked up Andrew and his wife. And the next day, they were at the White House meeting with President Trump. I cannot tell you all the details, but let's just say this would not have happened in a Biden administration. Fast forward to 2022, our discussions about freedom have become more complex. We now have social media platforms, which are borderless, larger than any country in the world, and difficult to impossible to regulate. On one hand, the social media platforms have made it possible for regular citizens to circumvent autocratic governments. You may have heard in 2021, in July, for the first time in 64 years, Cubans took to the streets, and that was thanks to social media. Those demonstrations are still ongoing, and the Cuban government is so threatened by them that they have actually shut off the internet, are consistently trying to block social media from being used in Cuba. You may have also heard about the metaverse, a mode of virtual reality where you can interact without physical interaction. The military is beginning to use it to stage simulations. The medical industry is experimenting with it. I don't know about you, but at this age, I'm excited about the invention of the virtual reality colonoscopy. Social media can be a force, but it's up to us to decide whether it's a force for good or not. And as a conservative, I would hate to relegate its regulation to the federal government. So as Jackie mentioned, I'm honored to be part of the inaugural set of trustees for an independent organization, the Oversight Board, that is looking at resolving the self-regulatory process. We have a long way to go. We have a long way to go. But conservatives are in the system of trying to figure this out. In closing, I like to invoke the immortal words of President Reagan. Freedom is never more than a generation away from extinction. You can say it with us if you know it, with me if you know it. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on to them to do the same. Or one day, in our sunset years, we will be telling our children and our children's children what it was like to live in the United States where men and women were free. Thanks to the promise of this great country, my father did not have to spend his sunset years telling his children and his children's children that story. With very hard work, he would be able to send his 3 children to college. He would rebuild his wealth, and his kids would grow up with the freedom that many of his family were denied. I don't think he ever imagined that his oldest daughter would go on to meet presidents or work with someone as fabulous as Ambassador Jackie Wolcott, or with Armando Valladares, or that one day his daughter would go to the United Nations with Armando Valladares and fight to condemn human rights violations in Cuba. Or that she would mention his best friend, Eddie, in a speech, and Eddie would eventually be released from prison and come to Puerto Rico, where he was my father's lawyer once again, until my father died 12 years ago. I promised my husband I would not cry, so I'm holding back the tears, but I'm so grateful to this country. Thanks for having me. It's such a delight to be here with you, the ladies of Naples. Because just like the ladies of Havana, it is you who will ensure American mothers' sons are not born slaves. Thank you.
Kristina got off the stage so fast. Oh, sorry. You want to give her a DeSantis cap.
I'll definitely get back on stage for that. Thank you. Ooh, yes, I love
our
them.
freedom-fighting governor.
Yes, picture. Thank you, thank you. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask Kristina?
So sorry, yes. This is the Q&A session. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Are you the moderator for the questions? Should I point out?
Oh, just pick.
Okay, yes. Yes. Thank you. There is this amazing group of ladies in white whose either their spouse or their children have been murdered or they are held in prison. And every Sunday they try to go to Mass. And every Sunday, almost every Sunday, they're beaten on the way to church. And some of them have been hospitalized. The lady who started it died mysteriously in a hospital after a beating. Those ladies, every Sunday, they're a thorn in the side of Fidel Castro. And, Fidel is dead, although I think the Surgeon General should have verified that. So, but the Castro regime still endures in Raul Castro and his brother. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Any other questions? Thank you so much.
Done? Okay.